All right, welcome to the third installment of the MUD Parcel Reading Series. So this series is a video companion to the MUD Proposal, which is an online journal and archive. That archive is currently on its 7th edition, and it's annually updated and features poets and projects that are international in scope and often multidisciplinary in focus, and translation is a big part of that. I'm Pat Clifford. I'm a poet and social worker and act as a producer of this series. And then my co-editor, Aryanil Mukherjee, is here as our host and discussant. So we're joined in this installment by poets and translators Pierre Alferi and Cole Swensen. Alferi is a novelist, essayist, visual artist, and poet. His works include Night and Day, which is translated by Kate Campbell from La Presse in 2012, and Kub Or, translated by Cole, as Oxo from Burning Deck in 2004. And then Swensen is the author of 13 collections of poetry and has translated 10 books of poetry into English from French. Her most recent books include Gravesend from University of California in 2012, Steel from Post Apollo in 2012 also, and Greensword, Ugly Duckling in 2010. So welcome. Is there anything you'd like to add to your bios?
No, many things I'd like to take back. But...
Well, we can't help you there, but
I'm going to actually, I'm going to take a moment just to quickly say I just had a book come out called Art in Time from Nightboat. And so just to give Nightboat a plug there.
Oh, nice, thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. And so we're going to, I think you're going to read from Pierre, your work, and Cole, your translations, maybe go back and forth. And so why don't we hand it over to you and we'll go off camera. And then when you're done, we'll come back and rejoin for a discussion.
So before you do that, Pat, I have a few 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences to say from the poem we are going to discuss today, read and discuss.
Okay.
And that is in the translation of Cole and in the words of Pierre. So here is where we intersect. Here is where we intersect. So here is what we should think. And here is what we should talk.
Awesome.
And let's roll it now.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pat, and thank you, Aryanil. Thank you, Cole, of course. So I'm going to read simply the most recent series of poems that was published in a book form 2 years ago, I believe. And the title is Et la rue. And to situate a little these poems, I think the simplest way is to explain the title, at least to comment on the title, because Et in Et la rue seems odd. It's right. It's like it comes after something, but in fact, it's the quotation of a slogan that was chanted many times during the very many demonstrations that Paris has known in the last 4 years for many different but connected issues, social and political issues. And so, Et la rue is the first half of a slogan that is quoted in the poems. And so the poems all, in a way, deal with the street, the daily life in a city, outside the public space of the street, but also about some things that happen in the street, not on a daily basis, but exceptionally. That is, demonstrations or insurrections, for instance. But enough for the context. I will now read those poems, and Cole will read her translations along the way. So, Et la rue is the title. La pluie glacée poursuit chacun dans son impasse, la berge étroite du flux de tôle autour des foyers électriques, les grappes de nous venues nous réchauffer les fesses ou nous brûler les yeux, sommes d'animaux rationnels, non entiers, fractions irréductibles, au dénominateur commun proche de zéro.
The glacial rain chases each one in his impasse, the narrow shore along the metal flow, the clutch of us around the electric heater. Come we to warm our buns or burn our eyes, adding up rational animals, non-whole, irreducible fractions with a common denominator approaching zero.
Trivial, tu cours les rues en sandales avec ta baguette dorée, tes sacs, on te croise parlant cuisine, relations professionnelles, organisation domestique, sport, le visage bougé, lourd de sens des rumeurs. Je te l'emprunte pour 100 pas sur le trottoir. Je coule mon malaise dans les vaisseaux de l'insignifiance partagée quand faire barrage excède et s'épuise le stock des répliques.
Trivial, you're out in the street in sandals with your golden baguette, your bags, your scene talking cuisine, professional relations, domestic organization, sports, the blurred face of rumors, heavy with meaning. I borrow it for a few yards of sidewalk. I sink my malaise in vessels of insignificance shared when the roadblock overflows and the stock of retorts is exhausted.
Quel intestin expulse les ressortissants d'ailleurs? Pourquoi, au juste un mot, dirait-il la violence? Violence qui se déploie, détaillée dans les opérations de police. La honte nous survivra. Nos descendants diront enjamber des corps, longer des familles à terre pour faire leurs courses. Ou des as du contrôle, héros de SF, parleront de l'époque où l'on s'est mis à s'entrevoir en mesure de chair humaine, biomasse, sans dessin net, et scruteront les figurants au drôle d'accent d'une série Z en costume. Tu n'avais pas vu le quartier depuis... Alors, ce qui a changé, les boutiques, le raffinement du concept phyto, chéro, déco, bio, occupera l'un des 10 000 vers des métamorphoses du vide. Mais, entre chien et loup, dans le filigrane des vitrines, bas des joues plissées, rideaux de théâtre, cendres sur la tête, le regard furtif, je ne sais quoi de minéral, raide usure nouvelle, fait froid dans le dos de qui me précède. Noir en bloc, basket jean parka, foulard et lunettes, et l'élégance même. Oh, you didn't want to try this one?
No, it's the other very short one.
Oh, sorry.
But I never mind.
No. I misunderstood. But... So the next. Aux churros, aux burgers, l'ange restauré sourit dans la zone art nouveau piétonne, envahi d'opticiens, agences de coiffure, salons bancaires, débit de vin local à bulles. La laideur sans frontières, derrière la comédie, le stade, projecteur plus haut que les flèches de leurs dames, clame le match nul, 1-1 de 2e division. Adossé à la basilique, les scénettes aux traits niellés dans les dalles du pavement redressé sont tirées des Écritures, et le profil des flics, médaillés, qui pêchent au lamparo, fouillent les ados noirs et bruns, est estampillé souvenir de Reims, par exemple. Qui vivent là, prêts à tourner le coin, si l'agent se pointe, l'œil volant d'un pôle à l'autre du pan, du panorama gris-bleu, guette le chasseur, l'éclat de la pièce, le déchet intact. C'est l'art de la fugue, malgré la fatigue, des jetés dehors, des secrets surexposés. Souriez, vous êtes filmés. La beauté n'est pas annoncée, des ouvriers qui dépassent chacun du trou qu'ils creusent, ni la résurrection des corps, enfouis en l'état. L'heure de la relâche, aujourd'hui tombe avec la nuit. Ouvre la bouche et bois la tasse avant d'avoir dit un mot. La vague déferle, des nouvelles nouvelles, laisse en apparence qui tonne intact. Tenir debout, surfer, s'échouer, plonger, l'apnée n'a qu'un temps, seul un monstre court devant les titans de l'oubli. Pour que la rue passe, qu'une BO passe dans le casque, des fenêtres s'ouvrent dans la paume, doublage et sous-titres éloignent, à moins qu'un visage n'arrête. L'infernale invention des Hollandais violents, la zone d'achat, croque le cœur de ville. On va vivre plus loin. On s'y fait, quitte à se faire à pied la fin du rayon, manquant d'air. Le trafic à peine ralenti par les seniors dans les tunnels, les mineurs isolés, planqués dans les fossés, campés dans les fourrés, cependant que le commerce chante au centre à tue-tête. C'est son truc. Autour, l'espèce vivante déchante en proie à la rue, sur les routes, des souris des villes et des camps, chassés par un gros chat, perçant, sourd, presque aveugle. Les louves de Chine, à l'âge incertain, dansent d'un pied sur l'autre, poing au fond des poches. Il pleut, le sexe est un travail de chien. Traité par l'ironie, in a bourgeois town, le romantisme de la révolte. Eh bien, dit le voisin du Sud, moi, je préfère la plus naïve des immatures protestations aux brillantes apologies du statu quo. Santé.
Take the ironic line if you like, in a bourgeois town, the romanticism of revolt. Oh, well, says the neighbor from the South. Me, I prefer the most naive and immature protestations to the brilliant apologies of the status quo. Cheers.
Ce n'est pas ici qu'est notre bonheur. Pourtant, c'est ici que nous nous croisons. Alors c'est d'ici qu'il nous faut parler. Alors c'est ici qu'il faut nous parler.
It's not here that we find our happiness, and yet it's here that we meet. And so it's about here that we must speak. And so it's here that we must speak to each other.
Quand la rue épuise les rêves, la réalité s'impose.
When the street drains dreams, a deep malaise reigns.
Propulsé dehors par le falsetto hors d'haleine depuis l'époque des Impressions de Curtis Mayfield, qui se hisse coûte que coûte dans le wagon, get ready, get down, move on up, keep on keeping on, pousse encore, tant que la lumière ne t'est pas tombée sur la tête.
Propelled outdoors by the falsetto, out of breath since the age of the Impressions of Curtis Mayfield, who gets, no matter what it takes, on board. Get ready, get down, keep on up, keep on keeping on, press on as long as the light hasn't fallen on your head.
Dans ta gueule, Google Earth, nous habitons Disney, son univers impitoyablement fluide, aux angles arrondis. Depuis nos pavillons, les trajets tout en courbe de Béziers s'évitent, cellulite photoshopée, meubles lisses, amortissent les chocs autour du village autocrade. L'herbe oscille comme une fourrure animée en 3D. Mais le déluge approche. Apprenons vite à vivre sous l'eau, sous le règne des GAFA. GAFA, l'indigestion d'algues au rythme des infos et usage d'infos.
In your face, Google Earth. We live in Disney, his world mercilessly fluid with rounded angles from our pavilion, the paths all Bezier curve, avoid photoshopped cellulite, smooth furniture, absorbs shock all around the auto-crud village. The grasses sway like fur in 3D anime. But the great flood approaches. Quick, we've got to learn to live underwater, under the reign of big tech, warning ingestion from algae, oh rhythm of news, using us.
Du complet bonheur sur la terrasse et les trajets vers et depuis la face plateau, de cet œuf de caille, de ce petit crabe à l'exosquelette fondant sous la dent, j'ai gobé tout l'été entier. Qui aurait cru le retrouver sur le trottoir écrabouillé?
A little utter happiness out on the terrace and along the paths to and from the plateau phase, a little quail egg, a little crabette whose exoskeleton melts beneath the tooth. I gobbled it all down a summer that long, whoever would have thought to find it on the sidewalk, crushed.
Buveur, causeur, chasseur, cueilleur de mots et demi, l'homme affable a deux beaux grands yeux bleus qui brillent quand il salue. Il vieillit vite dans l'âge d'abondance des coups pour un coup de main et porter la parole commune de coin de rue en coin de rue.
Drinker, talker, chaser, plucker of words and halves. The man of tales has two big, beautiful eyes that sparkle when he says hello. He ages fast in the age of abundance. Another shot for a spot of help and passing the local banter on from one street corner to another.
Plaqué par Noël sur la dalle, marchande, le droit de ramper dans le déballage des parentèles en remembrement, entre les spirales des siphons privés, jusqu'à la trappe, pour qui préfère franchir en sous-marin le détroit mortel de l'année.
Tackled by Christmas across the pavement, negotiate the right to grovel among familial networks unraveled in rearrangement between the spirals of private drains down to the trap, for those who prefer to cross the mortal isthmus of the new year underwater.
Rue tunnel où nos ombres cèdent à l'aspiration commune insu, gouttière écran du chaud en grisé, des gestes bruits, des voix visages, claquent les cartes abattues, puis entre l'extérieur irrité et l'intimité, la porte saloon qui bat, rebat, rebat, rebat.
Street tunnel where our shadows give way to the unknown, collective suction, gutter screen of the show grayed out, of raw gestures, of voices, faces, put the cards on the table, then between the outer irritated and the inner emited, the door of the saloon, which swings to and fro and to.
Carrefour de choix, où vieux et nouveaux riches mâchent des huîtres sous faux Modigliani. Lui faire épouser son image d'un jour hémiplégique, des murs anti-émeutes, l'auvent qui s'enflamme à l'heure des cocktails, et à la manœuvre, un cortège de têtes encapuchées est impossible, comme la coïncidence des mains droite et gauche.
choices of crossroads where old and newly rich munch oysters under fake Modiglianis to fuse his image to the half-paralyzed day of anti-riot walls, awning that goes up in flames at cocktail hour. The block of hoodies at the head is impossible, like the superimposition of right and left hands.
Et la rue, elle est tachycardiaque, elle enfle, s'emballe et bloque le progrès du désert, casse les rythmes des flux tendus que l'État noue, et quelquefois, elle est à nous.
A rue, it is acquis. Cardiac, it swells and speeds and blocks the onslaught of the desert, breaks the rhythms of fluid constrictions. The state eschews from time to time. A rue is anew. Don't say don't.
What the applause technique presume is, but I've seen snaps.
You should have registered applause. You should have sampled applause.
Yeah, we should have an applause.
Lead in the applause.
We'll work on that next time. But that was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
So
do you, yeah, go ahead, Brett. Go ahead.
Well, we were one of the things that we were talking beforehand, and Cole, you wanted to share some thoughts on the use of pun in this work, and I know from Aryanil and my work, it's one hand trying in the translation effort trying to get the pun somewhat as you intend, but also there's these unintended consequences or interpretations sometimes when you start to use pun or wordplay. So yeah, I'm very interested in hearing some of your thoughts on how that works in this piece and in general.
Yeah, and it's very important in this piece. And often the puns are like double and triple kinds of puns. So you get almost a kind of three-dimensionality, or I think of it as like light entering a prism and ricochets off of each other and just is really productive. It gets really multiplicatory. And so how to catch that? And I think as translators, we all know you can't. So how much do you play? What do you lose? I'm going to share a screen and just go to this last piece that we read is all based on and I don't know, Pierre, if you might want to talk about this, okay, this chant has been really, really important in the protests in the streets of Paris over the past year. Et la rue, elle est à qui, elle est à nous. So, and the street, who does it belong to? And it is ours. The construction there obviously creates a really rhythmic and very compelling kind of thing for a crowd to chant. So, et la rue, elle est à qui is, oh gosh, I miss, I'm going to just right here change this if I can. It is, so creating a pun on elle est tachycardiaque, but of course, when you hear it, you hear et la rue, elle est tachy. And so how do you catch that? So I was playing with the idea of a rue, it is a key, thinking of the old word, we use it still in English in forms like rueful or phrases like to rue the day. But it also, ages ago, was a noun meaning sorrow. And so do we want to play with that, try and get the sound, get a slightly different meaning, but one that seems to be within the realm of the sentiments that the poem is addressing, sort of group sorrow, et cetera, et cetera. Or, do we do the street is tachycardiac, which has a completely different meaning. For this middle one, I was playing where the puns come in with the sound business, because the other two places it comes in is que l'état nu, so that the state knots up. But of course we hear elle est à nous. And so that the state eschews, it's getting pretty far out there. Don't know if that's, and then to end with elle est à nous, a roux is à nous. I'm not going to stick with this one, I doubt. But to play with it, I think may send me towards something that's going to get in between the more literal translation here and the more homophonic translation. I'm really lucky because the person who wrote this poem is a very, very fluent English speaker, so he can explain to me everything that he goes on. Pierre actually does more work on these translations than I do. But there is the idea that conversation is always informing the translations, I think, increases the possibilities. So anybody who has any ideas, please send them. We would appreciate them very much.
I wanted just to add an echo to your description of the process as sometimes a translator myself. And I imagine it often, especially when when there's a question of a pun or even a rhyme or even, you know, all the sound aspect of the poems. It's impossible to translate it simply in the usual sense of translating, right? So to me, it is a bit like if you were doing a step in a dance, in a certain type of dance, and then someone else who dances, I don't know, tango or a local, you know, traditional dance that is completely different, has to suggest a move that exists for this type of dance, but that is analogous in a way, that echoes it. And it won't be the same, and the elements won't be the same, but it will look a bit the same. And so you have to watch from both sides to judge, of course, which we're lucky enough to be able to do with Cole. But when you don't have someone who tells you, yes, yeah, that works too, you have to trust yourself. But it's something like that. It's like inventing something that echoes something that will remain completely different.
Yeah. I wanted to say, and one, I think the dance analogy is a great one because there's a physical quality to the language.
There's a movement. There's a movement.
I also wanted to say that I think pun in this series plays a particularly important role because there's something that pun is acting in a social justice way, in the sense that it's often creating equations between what seem to be very disparate modes of diction, say street slang and technical language, or literary diction and daily speech. And to create a pun that blends those two underscores the fact that language is, all registers of language are equal, and we tend to hierarchize them and think of them as indicating social hierarchies as well. And punning in this way, I think, underscores the fact that that's not accurate, not in terms of language registers, nor in terms of social groupings. So there's a political aspect to the gesture.
Yeah,
that's a great point. It's like the dance gesture also, it's kind of, it's in the performance of it. Every time you dance a dance, it's actually a different dance. And so almost every time you translate, there's a different translation. But that's a way to kind of escape those kind of frameworks that tend to control or pigeonhole, like the translation or this ultimate translation. It's like, no, it's like, it's a very dynamic thing. And that it gets into that questions of justice and questions of, whose knowledge is valued over others. Yes.
Yeah.
There's also something, if I may add, because of what Cole said, made me think of something about the puns and the use of puns outside literary work. I mean, the use of pun in general is often, I think, is often a way of answering, of fighting back discourse and phrases and, gelled phrases, or phrases that come actually from places of power that are very present in our lives, and be able to make puns with these, although with proper names, is a way of escaping or of avoiding, in a way, the authority of the words that come to us as, you know, words of authority, and or names, because of course the puns on names are very often slurs, and they very often aim at powerful people as well. I'm sorry.
Well, I had one question. I know Aryanil had a question too, but it was a question that kind of gets to the justice aspect, the justice tradition, is the calling up of Curtis Mayfield in the work. And I'd be interested in kind of hearing, you know, how that enters the work, and kind of why you chose that, you know, Curtis particularly.
Yeah, well,
it seems to make a lot of sense from what you're saying, but I'm interested to see how that kind of got woven in.
Well, there's an arbitrary element in that, in the fact that I did at the time for several weeks listen to Curtis Mayfield on my earplugs when I traveled the city. So it really was the surrounding sound for me at the time. But also I meant to mention him. I didn't have to. I meant to mention him because, as you know, one of the first politically critical Afro-American singer, soul singer of the time. He's a symbol and still important. And many of the protests that gathered or coincided in the last month had also to do not only with social justice, but with racist violence from the police, with social segregation that coincides with racial, well, there are no races in real, but I mean, you know, perceived racial segregation. Yeah. So this was also in the political concerns of the time that Curtis Mayfield was relevant to me.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, you know, his work has become more and more kind of brought in and kind of revisited, and it stuck out to me. I was there's a jazz artist, William Parker, and he has a you know, a new biography that just came out, and it has a whole section in there about kind of his work and kind of reinvigorating and re-enlivening the legacy of Curtis Mayfield. And I was reading at the same time, and then I read your work, and I'm like, interesting, you know, the spirit of Curtis is kind of staying alive and teaching us in the present moment.
And I also, as everyone, I guess, love his voice. Simply, the voice is very feminine and seemingly fragile voice that he has is unique.
Yeah, seemingly. Aryanil, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments observations, I would say, Pierre, about your work in general, and then I'll come to this one. And one specific question, and I have another specific question for Cole. So the first comment, which is kind of a side comment, so apart from your many interests, you know, a multitude of interests you have, Pierre, I mean, into music, philosophy, cinema. You know, I work as a engineering mathematician, sort of, but in a very small way compared to Pierre Bézier, who you referred to, who was also an engineer and mathematician. So there is it's, you know, from OXO until here, I do see a deep interest, or at least references to computational geometry, to the language of mathematics. That has come up here, where you referred to rational animals and irreducible fractions, common denominator tending to zero, which reminds me of L'Hôpital, and so on. And then, of course, the Bézier curves, the curvaceous world of Disney as a symbol of market economy. So I am a little curious about this particular aspect of your poetry.
Well, it's a good question, but it makes me a little embarrassed, because I will have to confess to you that as for mathematics, real mathematics, I am a complete analphabet. I mean, I know
It
nothing.
doesn't matter.
Able to
About
read
the
the
interest.
simplest of equations. So I wouldn't want to you know, there shouldn't be ambiguity about that. I know really nothing. But I was always very interested in sciences, in many, yes, especially natural sciences. And well, the words or the phrases from mathematics that you found really refer to mathematics in the sense that it's entered our daily lives, right?
Mhm.
So the common denominator becoming also a phrase, and the zero actually refers also to the temperature in Celsius, of course.
Right.
And the Bézier curves now are everywhere, as you know.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
If you're on a computer, you cannot avoid them. So it's not that I'm really very aware of what's happening with mathematics, to tell you the truth.
Okay, but there is this interest. I mean, even in Cube or, you know, with the concept of a cube. I mean, I understand the cube comes from Rio cube, but then you delve pretty deep. In fact, when you send me, I still have the book here. When you send me a signed copy, you drew a little cube there, which has 6 faces, and you put a little 7th face, a diagonal face in between, in dotted lines. So that interest is something which has made me curious. There is a Mexican poet who seems to have a very similar kind of interest in this area, and he constantly brings it up. I don't know if you have heard of or if you have read. His name is Alberto Blanco.
No, I don't
He
think that.
teaches somewhere in the south of the United States, but he's a pretty well-known Mexican poet. So anyway, you know, many of the things that you, Cole, and Pat just now discussed, when I read this particular chapter, Elaru, I kind of read it almost like an American poem written in French and translated into American English because of, I guess, the many American references. Curtis Mayfield was just last week. Pat and I were talking about it. I know nothing about Curtis Mayfield, but he made me aware. I also saw reference to Keaton, Buster Keaton here, and I guess a lot of it comes from the equivalence of the street scenes in the United States versus what has gone on in France in the last 7 or 8 years, starting with the terrorist attacks, which Paris had never seen. And I made a little comment here, which is actually my question, drawing from the comment. You know, an interesting comparison between the 2 books I have read. This one, which I'm yet to read the entire book, Diverse Chaos, and Oxo. And Oxo was basically verbal and visual snapshots of street scenes in Paris. And this one talks about the street too. But in these 25 years, 2.5 decades or more, the streets have so dramatically changed, which has brought on what is palpable in Elaru is a quiet expression of dissent, which is what I noticed. A dissent about the, you know, about the unrelenting growth of market economy, which in 1994 had probably just began in most parts of the world. And now it's there everywhere. And the combat and the conflict, the art of policing, quote unquote. So in terms of language, of course, you know, Pat and I are reading your poetry in a foreign language. And although Cole is a terrific translator, and maybe Cole, you can also comment on it. So how much of a language, you know, how much you have bended and flexed the language according to the content, we don't know. But my question is more about the change in the contentive structure of your poem. over this period of time. Have you consciously thought about it, or how did you feel about the change coming on?
Well, your last question is easier to answer. I haven't consciously thought of, and even the fact, as you pointed out, that both books deal with the street, I hadn't really thought about. Perhaps also because Alferi is also included in larger, as you saw, selection with more diverse, I suppose, yes, diverse places in a way, or scenes. But you're absolutely right. The feeling and the reality of being of walking in the streets has changed quite a lot on many levels. It's definitely just to take one example, the presence of the police force is dramatically higher, greater now than it was in the 90s. It's really spectacular. And yes, the atmosphere certainly changed, although it's very difficult to define an atmosphere. But I suppose that at the time of, in the 90s, when I was writing the Tube poems, I had in a way a more friendly and contemplative relationship to what happened in the streets. And I wasn't very much aware of conflicts, although they were, of course, but they were not as palpable as they've become because of, you know, this violence, literal violence in the streets that we have witnessed for the last 10 years.
Yes. Yeah, that was.
We have time for maybe one more question and some closing comments. So, Aryanil, if you had.
Yeah, I had a question for Cole, which is a tall question, but maybe Cole, in your way, you can concise the answer. The question was about, which is well, the question is about something which I've already discussed, about the cultural challenges while trying to translate. Now, you know, all discussions that prevail in the United States that I have, I have experienced, deal with translations that only go back and forth across the Atlantic. And my question had always been that when you go to faraway places, let's say an example like Vietnamese poetry getting translated into Serbo-Croatian, or vice versa, or like the way I translate from Bengali to English and English to Bengali. So many times I at least, have this feeling that the culture is so diverse, so largely disparate, that it is really difficult to fill the cracks. I have a book on John Ashbery, translated into Bengali, and I was in touch with him all along, with David Kermani in particular. And sometimes, at times, I would tell David that, it is really difficult to be that close to the original text. The use of a torch, for example, the Bengali word is moshal, which has a very strong, political air to it. And that word cannot be used without, because those torches were used in political rallies throughout centuries. And this is not the torch in your backyard in the American context. And so I remember David said something interesting, and he said, well, the Inuits, they greet each other by rubbing their noses. And we greet each other by shaking hands. So try the cultural translation as much as you can. Whereas other people feel that, well, I probably have to use footnotes, which I try to resist. So what has been your experience? You've been a prolific translator in this regard.
As you point out, the farther the cultures are apart, the more difficult it is. And French and American culture have been friends since, before the various revolutions of the, 18th century. So I've got much less of a problem than someone who's translating a Vietnamese poem into Serbo-Croatian. As you say, it's just like huge, or a much easier time of it than you have translating Ashbery into Bengali. I think the example of the torch is a really good one because it underscores that we're never translating a word, we're translating a whole connotative field. And so how do you wrangle? We tend to, think of a word as this small thing that fits in between two others in a line, and it's not. It's this radiating sphere that's always interacting with all of these others. And I can't imagine how you do it.
Well, no, my question rather is, what would be sort of trying to learn from you, what would be your recommendation in that case, especially when, translating whole concepts. I see how you use the word, the French word roux, the various connotations of it, how much can it be transported, or if we sometimes feel that we cannot really bring the connotations across, should one go and try and use a different word instead?
The connotations are there, and I think the connotations stay, unfortunately, with the word. So we try and translate connotations, but in fact, we can only translate the word. So the idea of choosing a word that might have more of that connotative field than the literal translation of the word would have, I think is an interesting way to go. With the Rue Street, fortunately, those two connotative fields, they're pretty similar, but there are ones when you get into, and I happen to be working on another piece that deals with certain kinds of paths. So the same idea, coincidentally, but sentier and path, there are all sorts of connotative fields that don't overlap really well. And so how to choose that. And I think just keeping it in mind and seeing where else you can say with the use of an adjective somewhere else in the line, get some of the connotative field that's being missed.
Oh yeah,
So
I like this idea very much. I believe in that. I hadn't thought of that, but it looks like a wrong way, dishonest way of translating. But I did it many times. When I can't get certain connotations by the translated term, I try to put it somewhere else.
Yes, right.
Really, what you said. That is, what you didn't gain in a part of the translation, try to get it through another part of the sentence, or even another sentence, just to kind of,
I think it's a matter too of thinking, it's not just the denotations we want. We need tone and sound and connotation, history, all these things. And so thinking of the given piece as, I like the term, everything must be accounted for, and thinking of it in that kind of economic term and thinking, okay, this piece is an economy. It's all of these shifting and elements in relation to each other in a very three-dimensional way. And so literally trying to account for, trying to get a balance, trying to keep the balance sheet in balance, and knowing that you can use, that it's an overall gesture. It's not a point-by-point gesture. I think that taking, and then you have to figure out what your base unit is. So for instance, in this project, Et la Rue, I think the base unit is the whole series, the 24 poems working together. So I'm definitely trying to get each poem to be accountable, but I'm also going to be thinking of an accountability throughout the whole series.
It sounds like an equation that Aryanil would be very good at creating and trying to solve for.
In fact, just to make you one last line, just to make you aware, here's a book. This is my second or third book of essays, where I have a chapter on 16 poets. It's once again, I have to translate the translation the title would translate to Another Place for Poetry,
Okay.
Volume 2. And here I have discussed 16 poets whose work I love across 100 years and different languages. And there's a chapter on Pierre, and I took the liberty to do a third-hand translation of your poems from Oxo, just the first chapter
Great.
in this book. So I translated from your English into Bengali. And let me just show you the cover page, Pierre. There's a picture of you here. I don't know if you can see the picture.
Well, how young?
Taken a couple weeks ago.
Thank you.
That's it.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks so much. I think we could.
Thank you. This
Thank
was
you.
fun to talk.
Aryanil. And thank you, Cole.
Well, thank you, Pierre, and thank you all. A nice conversation.
Very
Yes.
nice.
And I'd like to thank you both as well, and thank our audience who will be watching this. And then I invite people to watch the other episodes of this series and to join us for our next MUD Parcel installment, which will feature poet Kathy Wagner.
Great. Nice.
So,
Good.
thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.